Robert and Laura Hale were the couple everyone in Pine Hill admired. Robert, a former Army officer, had served his country with distinction, earning medals for bravery in the face of danger. His strong sense of duty and unshakable moral compass were the bedrock of his character. After retiring from the military, he transitioned into a role as a private security consultant, a job that demanded long hours and took him away from home for days, sometimes weeks at a time. Laura, on the other hand, was the epitome of grace and warmth. She had dedicated her life to raising their two children and keeping their home a place of love and stability. She was active in the community, organizing charity events, volunteering at the local food bank, and always being there to lend a helping hand to anyone in need. To outsiders, their marriage seemed perfect, an ideal union of two people who complemented each other in every way. The cracks began to show. But as Robert's absences grew longer, the cracks in their marriage began to show. Laura, despite her outward smile, struggled with the loneliness that crept in during the long nights when Robert was away. She missed the man she had fallen in love with, the one who had been her partner in all things. The emotional distance between them widened, and Laura found herself feeling increasingly isolated, despite being surrounded by friends and community. It was during one of Robert's extended trips that Laura first met Father Thomas. He had recently been appointed as the new priest at St. Andrew's Church, replacing the beloved Father O'Reilly, who had retired after decades of service. Father Thomas was different, young, charismatic, and with a way of speaking that drew people in. His sermons were not just religious teachings, they were powerful orations that touched on the struggles and hopes of everyday life, making the ancient scriptures feel relevant and alive. A growing bond. Laura found herself attending Mass more frequently, not just on Sundays but during the week as well. Father Thomas's words provided a balm to her weary soul, and she began to confide in him. What started as innocent conversations about faith and family slowly turned into deeper, more personal discussions. Laura shared her feelings of loneliness, her fears about her marriage, and the growing distance between her and Robert. Father Thomas listened with patience and understanding. He offered counsel, but he also offered something more: attention and compassion that Laura desperately needed. As time went on, their meetings became a regular part of Laura's life. They would meet in his office at the church, sometimes for hours, talking about everything from theology to personal struggles. Laura felt a connection with Father Thomas that she hadn't felt with anyone in a long time. The affair begins. But the bond between them didn't remain platonic for long. Father Thomas, despite his vows, found himself drawn to Laura in ways that went beyond his role as a priest. He admired her strength, her beauty, and the vulnerability she showed him. He began to rationalize his growing feelings, convincing himself that what he felt for Laura was something special, something outside the normal rules. The first time they crossed the line was in the quiet of the church's sanctuary, where they had stayed late after an evening mass. The church was empty, the only light coming from the flickering candles on the altar. As they talked, their hands brushed, and suddenly the tension that had been building between them broke. They kissed, and in that moment, all the boundaries they had tried to maintain crumbled. What followed was a passionate, clandestine affair. They met in secret, away from prying eyes, finding solace in each other's arms. But in a small town like Pine Hill, secrets are hard to keep. People began to notice changes in Laura. She seemed happier, but also more distracted. Father Thomas, too, became more withdrawn, as the burden of their affair weighed on him. The discovery. Robert, meanwhile, had grown increasingly suspicious. He had always trusted Laura, but the changes in her behavior were undeniable. She was more distant, her mind often elsewhere. When Robert tried to reach out to bridge the growing gap between them, he found Laura evasive. She would disappear for hours with vague explanations, leaving Robert to wonder what was really going on. One day, Robert decided to follow her. He trailed her to St. Andrew's Church, where she spent more and more of her time. From the shadows, Robert watched as Laura met with Father Thomas. At first, he saw nothing out of the ordinary, just two people talking. But then he saw something that confirmed his worst fears: a tender touch, a lingering look, and finally, an intimate kiss. Rage boiled within Robert as he watched the scene unfold. He had given everything to his country and his family, and this was how he was repaid. The betrayal cut him to his core, and he could barely contain his fury. He wanted to confront them right then and there, but something held him back. Instead, he decided to bide his time, to gather more evidence before making his move. The murder of Paul. Unbeknownst to Robert, another member of the church had also noticed the growing closeness between Laura and Father Thomas. Paul, a devout churchgoer who spent much of his free time volunteering at St. Andrew's, had seen the furtive glances and whispered conversations. One evening, he stumbled upon the two of them in a compromising position. Shocked and angered, Paul confronted Father Thomas, demanding that he come clean about the affair. Father Thomas, who had already been struggling with guilt and fear, panicked. He knew that if Paul exposed their secret, it would mean the end of his career, his reputation, and possibly his freedom. Desperate to silence Paul, Father Thomas concocted a plan. He invited Paul to the church's bell tower one night under the pretense of discussing the matter privately. As they stood at the edge of the tower, Paul became more insistent, his voice rising with emotion. In a moment of madness, Father Thomas acted. He pushed Paul off the tower, watching in horror as the man plunged to his death. The sound of Paul's body hitting the ground echoed through the night, but the churchyard remained eerily silent. Father Thomas, trembling with fear and adrenaline, quickly descended the tower and dragged Paul's body to a hidden corner of the church basement, burying it beneath old, forgotten relics. Robert's confrontation. The next morning, Paul was reported missing, but there were no immediate leads. The town was abuzz with speculation, but no one suspected Father Thomas. The priest, now burdened with the weight of two secrets, his affair and the murder, continued his duties, though the strain was evident in his hollow eyes and unsteady hands. Robert, still reeling from his discovery of the affair, decided it was time to confront Laura. He waited for the right moment, and when he saw her heading to the church one afternoon, he followed. This time he did not stay hidden. He burst into the sanctuary just as Laura and Father Thomas were about to embrace. The fury that had been building inside him exploded. The confrontation was intense. Robert accused them both of betrayal, his voice shaking with rage and hurt. Laura tried to explain, to apologize, but her words fell on deaf ears. Father Thomas, too, attempted to calm Robert, but his efforts only fueled the fire. In the heat of the moment, Robert lunged at Father Thomas, his fists flying. The priest, overwhelmed by panic, grabbed the nearest object, a heavy candlestick, from the altar and swung it at Robert. The blow struck Robert on the head, and he collapsed instantly, blood pooling around him. The church, once a place of peace, was now stained with the horror of what had just happened. Laura screamed, but it was too late. Robert was dead, and Father Thomas, realizing the gravity of what he had done, fled the scene, leaving Laura alone with the body of her husband. The aftermath. The small town of Pine Hill was soon engulfed in a whirlwind of shock and grief. The news of Robert's death spread quickly, and when the police arrived at the church, they made a grisly discovery. Not only had Robert been murdered, but Paul's body was also found hidden in the basement. The revelation that Father Thomas was responsible for both deaths sent shockwaves through the community. A manhunt was launched to capture Father Thomas, who had fled into the dense woods surrounding Pine Hill. The search was led by Detective Sarah Mitchell, a seasoned officer known for her tenacity. For days, the townspeople watched and waited as the hunt unfolded. Father Thomas, exhausted and desperate, was eventually cornered in an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. He was apprehended without further violence, his attempt to escape ending in failure. The trial. The trial that followed was swift, the evidence overwhelming. Father Thomas was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the courtroom, Laura sat silently, her face pale and drawn, as the man she had once turned to for solace was led away in handcuffs. The reality of what had happened, the lives ruined, the trust shattered, was almost too much to bear. Pine Hill, a town that had always taken pride in its close-knit community and its values, was left to grapple with the dark legacy of betrayal and violence. St. Andrew's Church, once a beacon of hope and refuge, now stood as a grim reminder of the tragedies that had unfolded within its walls. A haunting legacy. In the years that followed, the town slowly began to heal. Now, if you want to watch another true crime story like this, click the one on screen now.